Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. The footage and pictures coming out of Australia are devastating. Homes burned down along with 5 million hectares of bush being destroyed. Kangaroos fleeing the fire and koalas perishing. Ecologists from the University of Sydney estimate almost 500 million mammals have been lost. Authorities report the loss of 25 human lives. Again, the picture of Australia on fire is one of devastation. But what has caused this fire season to have become so deadly? And what can be expected in the future? We discuss this in detail. We're joined by Professor Peter Newman, who is an environmental scientist and professor of sustainability at Curtin University. He joins us from Perth. And Mr. Svein, who's the director of the climate consultancy Klima 2020 and former UN director. He joins us from Norway. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Professor Newman, let me begin with you. Now, bushfires happen in Australia each and every year. But why is the situation so terribly different and so bad this year?
The last 2 years have been a giveaway. We should have expected it because the whole country was being dried out. There was a significant drought that has spread right through the middle of the country, right into the wet subtropical forests. They were dried out. They were ready to burn. And many scientists and firefighting experts warned the government that this was going to happen.
Right. You're saying that the government was being warned about what was about to happen, and yet what we're seeing, a lot of anger on ground, especially directed towards the government. They haven't taken enough action. There was a state of inertia. Why was this so?
Well, I think that it gets down to the belief that that climate change is not real, that it's something that's just a news factor. And many of the politicians on the right side of Parliament rather than the left side have been swayed by media and a number of people who keep saying that you can take it or leave it. But nature has struck back. Nature is telling us, look, it's real. The extremes of weather are going to be increasing. The energy in the atmosphere, in the oceans, are providing extremes of weather. And we are now showing this. We are demonstrating to the world that it can sweep through your country in a way that is devastating, and it is not easy to do anything about it, but at least we should have been properly prepared.
Right. Mr. Tveitdal, to you, and talking about this devastation that's being caused, that is so very evident, loss of life, loss of habitat, it's deadly, completely deadly at this point in time. Now, Australia, and when we talk about its record in terms of climate change discourse and what measures it has taken, how has the country fared so well?
Well, at the last climate summit in Madrid, Australia was amongst the countries that tried to stop the conference to increase the ambitions on reducing emissions. So it is obvious, as Peter say, that the current government in Australia is not in a way taking into account that climate change is here. Actually, in Australia, the global average temperature have increased by approximately 1.1 degree, but in Australia it has increased by 1.5 degrees, and it burns when it gets warmer, hotter, and drier. So if we are not stopping this now, I think that apocalyptic experiences like this would be the new normal, because now the temperature in the world has increased by a little bit more than 1 degree. But if we are not stopping this trend, we might see between 3 and 4 degrees warming by the end of the century. And that will not be a climate crisis, that will be a climate catastrophe. And it is, in a way, sad to notice that Australia, that is so hurt by this development is not working hard on the international scene to do something with it.
Right. Mr. Newman, something that you and Mr. Tveitdal have stated is the fact that the government hasn't been doing enough. But as Mr. Tveitdal was saying, that we have gone far above what our target was, is trying to cap the temperature rise. In this case, can the government in any situation be more prepared for what was about to happen?
Yes, the adaptation processes significantly behind what has actually been happening. We can do better in preparation. We now know that the bush will catch fire in ways that will get out of control very quickly, and it will spread very quickly. So we have to prepare the bush to be more have less combustible material in it at the ground level where the spreading happens. But in the end, there's not a lot you can do to stop the big fires, because these trees are exploding because they have so much evaporation from the heat, causing these vapors to explode. They become like flamethrowers. And they're spreading, jumping across half a kilometre at a time. So there's not a lot you can do when that sets in, but we can stop them spreading by doing more preparation. That requires resourcing, and it requires taking seriously. And the professor is right in saying that we just haven't done enough to take seriously climate change. I think the politics is going to change with this. It is going to be a significantly different Australia that will come out of this.
Right, and you're saying that the politics will change after what has proved to be a watershed event. Now, just moving back a little and talking about the fact that there wasn't enough preemptive measures taken, but now that the situation has unfolded, what is the government trying to do in order to tackle the situation? What are the efforts being made on the ground at this very point in time?
Yes, there are still fires alight. In our state, they are out of control still, and they're going into areas where there are fewer people. You see, the extraordinary coincidence was that people flocked to the coasts over the Christmas period. And the coasts are usually, they don't burn. They're wet, subtropical forest that is not easy to burn. But they are on fire right down to the beach. This was the extraordinary thing. And that's why there is now no safe place to go. And that really is changing the culture and the politics of Australia. But the preparations are one thing. What we do now is that we have to get more planes, helicopters, boats into these areas to actually provide the resourcing that's needed. We've sent the troops in, and there are a lot more volunteer firefighters coming from across the world to help. There's a lot of money going into it now, and $2 billion has been promised now for a rebuild of these communities, many of them totally devastated. But I think there will be a lot of people who will say, I'm not going to live there anymore. Living in the forest is dangerous. Now, that's a change.
Right. That, in fact, is a very major change there when people want to move out of the place that they've called home for so long because of the devastation that is being caused. Professor Newman, in a place like this, which is prone to, of course, bushfires, it happens every year. This time it is worse. What sustainable measures can be taken in order to make the community more resistant for the future?
Well, we can certainly build differently. You can build fire-resistant houses. We're still building wooden houses in places that are just not appropriate. They'll catch fire very quickly. You can do all kinds of things around the edges of communities in making sure that the eucalypts in particular are not planted right next to houses. But you can also enable people to have plans in place. So when the word gets out And the scientists can tell you very precisely where these fires are going in general. The last few kilometres can be different, but whole areas can be evacuated, and they need to be very clear in their message, and people need to know what to do when they leave or when they stay, and that is a choice that is left to them. Those kind of processes are now being reviewed significantly because we just can't afford to have these kind of disasters again.
Right.
And the stock losses.
Prof. Newman, just one last question to you. You mentioned earlier that the Australia that is going to come out after this devastation will be an Australia that isn't like the one before it. What changes do you see happening in terms of political will?
Well, I think that the number of conservative politicians who are coming out and saying, yes, we now need to do more. We need more commitment to be part of this. The shameful thing that while these fires were happening, we were in Madrid trying to stop the rest of the world from doing things. That is appalling. We should never be like that. We've learned how to play cricket again. Why can't we learn how to play in the world as a proper citizen that provides solutions, not provides ways of trying to stop this change? I hope that I can be as proud of my cricket team and as I am in the future of my country.
Right. Professor Peter Newman, thank you so much on that point for joining us and talking to us from Perth. Mr. Tveitdal, we were talking about how there will be a change in political will for Australia after this event, after these fires. But as we've been seeing throughout 2019, this wasn't the only isolated event when it comes to forest fires and raging fires. It seems like the world doesn't learn, and especially the most developed nations. Is that something you would dispute?
Yeah, that is obvious. One point related to Australia is that we are talking now about how much will it cost to clean up what has happened now. They talk about 2, maybe 6 billion Australian dollar. But as of now, the fossil energy in Australia is subsidized with something like $29 billion a year. So a starting point here, and not only in Australia, would be to reduce or take away subsidizing fossil fuel. For in the case of Australia, it's a kind of recipe on suicide, because in a way you are funding your own huge big problem. So in general, the world is not doing as much as they should do. As I said earlier, we are on the path to a warming on 3 to 4 degrees during this century. And what we see now about damage from climate change is just a starting point. We will have apocalyptic things to happen, and we'll see that as the normal if we don't turn the trend very fast. And as of now, we are not on that track. Right. Of course, next year, when on the next summit in Glasgow, then all the countries in the world will come up with their new pledges on reduction of emissions, which is the only way forward. There is no other way to solve the problem. Then there is a chance, and we hope that these pledges will be much stronger than what is the current pledges. But as the professor said, as I mentioned, Australia, they have just tried to reduce these ambitions. They don't want it. They don't want to see it. Maybe they want to go on with coal. Australia, 70% of the energy there comes from coal, and they're a big coal exporter.
And Mr. Tveitdal, that's an essential point you make. I'm going to take this to Professor Dora Marinova, who's just joined us. She is the professor of sustainability at the Curtin University. She also joins us from Perth. Thank you so much, Professor Marinova, for joining us. Now, as Mr. Tveitdal was stating, that the subsidies given to fossil fuels continue to persist, and they're consistently given. Now, in all of this, do you think Australia is moving towards a systematic change? And do you think that's possible after this recent conversation of what has been happening after the fire devastations?
It's a very good question, and my answer is that I don't see it possible under the current leadership that we have. But at the same time, I see a lot of momentum that is building up across civil society. And we are talking about young people, we are talking about academics, people who are educated, we are talking about certain political parties that have an agenda which stays away from fossil fuels. And we're also seeing in investment funds and superannuation funds that are trying to stay away from anything to do with fossil fuels. So there is a momentum within society, and this sooner or later will create change. But under the current leadership, we are only seeing the desire for the lobby coming from the fossil fuel sector, as well as from other sectors such as, for example, the food and agricultural sector, to continue with the status quo. If I have a little bit of time, I would love to expand a little bit around food, because it's only recently that we started to point at food as being a big contributor to climate change, and particularly the obsession with animal-based products. And Australia is responsible for leading the world in this unhealthy trend. So why are animal-based products contributing to climate change? There are different mechanisms. One is directly through greenhouse gas emissions, through methane, which is much more powerful than carbon dioxide, but it's also through land clearing. We are clearing native vegetation, we're getting rid of forests in order to provide pastures, and that has severe implications for retention of moisture in the soil, for providing habitat for natural species. So in addition to the fossil fuel aspects, we also need to reconsider how we are growing food, how we are feeding the population on the globe, and there are huge differences between a country such as Pakistan and a country such as Australia. In Pakistan, we are talking about meat consumption probably around between 16 and 20 kilograms per person per year, and we are talking about 120 per person per year in Australia. So Australia has to reconsider its own behavior on many levels in relation to support.
And Professor Marinova, as you're stating here that the civil society is going through an awakening of sorts, realizing what needs to be done. In this, do you think this pressure being built is enough to actually put pressure on the current government? You said that you don't see a change coming within the leadership that is prevailing at the present time. But given what has just happened, do you feel like it is enough for them to change track?
If you're in government, you also hold power. So the government has been trying to put in place legislation that can actually stop civil movements and that can stop people protesting and going on strikes, including using smart technologies and face recognition and things like that to actually target the people who disagree with its current agenda. But we are a democracy. That means that the time that this government will be put to the test will come soon with the next elections. And I don't think after the crisis and the catastrophic events that we're witnessing now, this government will actually be re-elected based on their track record and on their values that have started to go to a different, to go away from the values that the bulk of the Australian society has, and particularly the young people.
Right. Mr. Svein Tveitdal, Professor Marinova, very, very interesting point, and that is how the government in power is not just, does not only have a bad track record of its own, but it's trying to undermine the power of civil society activists who are trying to push for a more green agenda. Do you see this trend all across the world, especially in terms of those countries which contribute the most to emissions, an assault on civil society activists?
No, I think the professor is right that we have seen in the last year a growing movement of people that is really concerned, and we can see changes. But the point is that the changes is not going fast enough, and what it doesn't take the example of food or meat. It doesn't help that 1 million people is aware of this and change their diet. We need politicians that make it more easy for us to take environmental and climate-friendly decisions. And there is a huge, big opportunity for the green business to boom. But the market in itself will not solve the problem because the fossil lobby is so extremely strong. So I think the only way, in particular in democracies, as was mentioned, is that we need to vote out the fossil-fueled politicians and get in environmental champion environmental champion politicians that want to be a part of the solution, because the existing politicians, for example, in Australia, is a part of the problem, and they are not going to solve the problem. And the only way out in democracy is to vote them out, actually.
Right. Mr. Just talking a little about the conference you mentioned before in Madrid and how Australia was one of the countries that was trying to block a move that would come to a decision about what to do in the future. Have we seen any progress on trying to construct a more coherent architecture when we're talking about dealing with the climate crisis globally?
Going to be honest, I have to say no, because when there was an optimism in Paris in 2015, all the governments in the world, they was pledging, they put on the table pledges about what to do with their emissions. And they know that these pledges was not sufficient, because if everybody did what they put on the table, the warming would still be more than 3 degrees. But when we are now starting to see what is happening, the countries, including Australia, is lagging behind what they pledged in Paris. So the situation is extremely dangerous and difficult, actually. The big battle comes in Glasgow next year, and we will see what is happening. But I think that what is going on in Australia now should be something that would change the opinion, so that they really are doing something that is necessary not to make this worse in the future. Right. So I think the tipping point on policy, in a way, is how much have we to experience from damage from climate change before we do something with it. And I hope, for instance, now that point is coming in Australia. Other difficulties in Paris is, of course, that President Trump is not addressing climate change at all. You had a new leader in Brazil with Bolsonaro. We have big fires also in Brazil and in California, but so far the leaders there, they are not doing.
The leadership is not doing nearly enough. I point there, Mr. Tveitdal, and that's an essential point. Professor Marinova, before we just end this segment, I want to stress on the damage that has been caused to the habitat in order to remind our audience, and especially ourselves, of what the damage has been caused throughout these fires. Tell us about that state.
Well, we have 24 people being killed, probably about close to 30 missing. This is the human side of things. And that's probably together with about more than 2,000 houses destroyed, probably about 2,500 buildings altogether, 15 million acres of land being burned. But those who have suffered the most are those that do not vote and are not part of our democracy. This is the wildlife of Australia. And Australia is an amazing continent with amazing wildlife. So we have probably about 500 million animals these are the estimates. They're only estimates. Nobody will ever know how many animals are being killed. We're talking about kangaroos, koalas. A third of the koala population of New South Wales have been decimated by the fires. Wallabies, reptiles. We also have bats dying because of the record high temperatures. We are losing frogs, insects. Probably there will be a very high biodiversity price that the continent will pay as a result from these bushfires. And these animals are the ones that don't have a voice in the decisions that we make. There are a lot of goodwill people, a lot of volunteers that are risking their lives to help them, but it is a huge cost to the natural environment.
Right. Professor Marinova, those figures that you've stated are frightening, and we can all hope that things only get better, especially for everyone involved, everyone living in Australia, and especially the wildlife on that point. Thank you so much, Professor Dora Marinova, for joining us from Perth, and Mr. Svein Tveitdal for joining us from Norway. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we take a look at what extreme weather patterns mean for the future of social trends and communities. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. From the deadly floods in Indonesia to droughts and wildfires in other parts of the world, weather patterns are becoming more extreme across the world. But what are the consequences of this change, and are communities preparing enough to cope? Let's take a look at this in greater detail. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. Brenden May, who is the chairman and founder of Robertsbridge, which is an organization working to develop sustainable strategies for national and global companies. He joins us from London. Also joining us today is Mr. Brady Fergusson, who's a climate change activist and advocate for climate change migrants. He joins us from New York. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Brady, let me begin with you. Now, as I mentioned, we're seeing manifestations of extreme weather patterns all across the world. But do these isolated events in certain parts of the world have global impact all across the world?
Well, I think we're seeing patterns from these isolated incidents. We're seeing patterns. It's not just flooding in Indonesia, but we have flooding in other parts of the world as well. It's not just these huge fires in Australia, but here in the United States where I live, very recently we also had fires here. So they're isolated incidents, but they're all connected because the same things are happening all over the world. And the connection is climate change is really increasing the frequency and the intensity of these events.
Right. Brady, now you, of course, are an activist and you focus on the migration that will be caused, displacement that will be caused by climate change. That's something that I do want to get towards. When we're talking about one country suffering because of these events, it does become another country's problem and a burden, especially when we talk about displacement. Could you expand upon that a little?
Yes, there are certainly cross-border issues that come up in terms of climate change displacement. Although most of the displacement that has already occurred and that will occur will probably happen within borders. If you take, for example, Bangladesh, there are already many, many people who are being displaced who live near the ocean due to those rising sea levels, but most of them are moving to the capital city, Dhaka, just moving within the country. So that will probably be the majority of the displacement. At the same time, there also is cross-border migration. Here in the United States right now, we have a lot of people from Central American countries trying to come to the United States. And the reason is because weather patterns have made it more difficult for them to farm in their homes, so they're leaving and trying to go somewhere else. So the cross-border migration will also be a big part of that. When you also have people from Africa moving to Europe, in a lot of different parts of the world, we're already seeing that.
Right. Brenden, let me do now, as we're talking about some of the social changes we will witness more of in the future due to climate change, what are some of the things that we can expect to happen, especially in employment sectors and business sectors, as weather patterns change, as climate change manifests in different forms?
Well, I think the first thing to say, is these are unprecedented times. And as Brady has said, these patterns, when you join them up, it is very clear that everything that scientists have been saying for a long time is now happening. We used to talk in business about climate change being a risk that we needed to take account of at some point in the future. I used to mock up headlines of websites saying the headlines might one day look like this and tell clients that. We're now there. And where we've got to is precisely in keeping with what the scientists have been saying for time. And we're in a very unusual stage now where the world is kind of on a war footing with nature. And it's a war that we can't win if business carries on as usual. This is not a time for reducing impacts, for using things a bit more wisely, reducing carbon emissions by 10, 20%. If you look at the images on your screen, we are past that point. So what we're going to see, I hope, is increasingly disruptive, bold, audacious interventions from businesses and, of course, from governments to tackle what is a global emergency. This is now a public health disaster. It is an economic disaster. People say, we have to prioritize growth and jobs, and in poor countries, employment in the now matters more than thinking about nature and climate in the future. My question would be, well, how do you think that's going? And what do you think the economic cost to Jakarta is, to Australia is, to California is, to the 16 African countries suffering from climate emergencies? So there's going to be enormous change in the business community.
Right. And Brenden, you work to develop sustainable strategies for global companies and national companies. What are what is one of the main things you see as a problem when we're still dealing with the conversation of climate change, especially from private investors, private companies?
Problem still with finance and the banking sector, so what those organizations will actually fund or lend money to. That sector has been slower than most in embracing the low carbon agenda, the deforestation agenda. But I think the most common hurdle that we're seeing is that not enough companies are being led from the very top on this agenda. So they have sustainability departments that are doing their best. But in my experience, it's when the chief executives and the boards understand this issue as a fundamental operational risk issue to their business, that's when things start to shift. The other barrier is we're often still talking about business within the context of current business models. So less use, more prudent use. That's not going to work here. We can see it. So what we need to do is rethink entire business models, entire sector models. We need to be renting and borrowing and reusing stuff, not buying new stuff all the time. We need to think completely differently about how capitalism is going to operate, because the consequences of industrial capitalism are on your screen now, and they are going to cause as much social upheaval and unrest, as we've heard, as they are unrest to nature and to biodiversity.
Right. Brady, now, following from everything that Brenden has stated, that working within the economic model that has been prevalent for so long, it just is not feasible for our future. But the question is, who are we supposed to look towards to bring about this change? Now, there is a profit motive that companies still abide by, and the governments themselves have their own agendas. What can we expect? Who should take the lead in this?
Yeah, well, I think it's going to have to come from the government side, because as far as the businesses and the companies that are so used to this system that we've already had, that are making money off the current system, I think it's going to be more difficult for them to change without policy really forcing them to change. Putting a price on carbon could be one way to really get us started. And some countries have already started with carbon pricing schemes. For example, Canada has one, but we really need it all around the world for it to be truly effective. But that's one way where within capitalism, we can start to see a change. We just have to make that market correction by putting a price on carbon. But I believe it does have to come from the government. I have more faith that government action first will do it rather than just counting and hoping on business leaders to do it. But I'd also say and to make government action happen, we really have to have that political will come from the people. And with these youth-led movements that we've seen with the climate strikes all around the world in recent months and continuing now into this year, I think that's really great. And with people putting pressure on their governments, that's what it's going to take to make this happen.
Right. Brenden, now, when we talk climate change, it's a global phenomenon, it's a global issue. And then when we talk about legislation, of course, that is a more local issue. Is it possible to tackle this global issue with localized legislation and agendas, or do we need to focus on more internationalized plans?
I think we need both. And yes, a carbon price absolutely has to be one of the incentive mechanisms, and it has to be set at a meaningfully high level to reflect the social and environmental cost of continuing to run the global economy on effectively dead carbon. Fossil fuels are dead carbon. And we need to move the global economy onto one based on living carbon. So things like cellulosics, for example. We need huge incentives, tax breaks for environmentally friendly, more sensitive technologies, cleaner sources of energy, cleaner technologies, cleaner ways to make plastics, for example, bioplastics, cellulose-based, fiber-based. All those things are there. They just need to be scaled up. And of course, at the national level, you can do quite a lot. So, I mean, the British government, has a fairly ambitious net zero carbon strategy compared with some other developed countries. But in the end, as we know from Australia and elsewhere, these issues do not recognize national borders. Already the smoke haze from Australia is polluting Auckland in New Zealand. So you have to have internationally binding agreements, but then the enforcement that people who break those agreements or miss those targets will face financial penalties. So I think it's partly carrot, partly stick. There's so much good technological development going on there, but meanwhile, the global economy is still subsidizing dirty sources of fuel, and that can't continue.
Right. Brenden, you earlier mentioned how this will become an operational issue for many of the businesses. Now, when we talk about the scale of the issue and the fact that even trying to take preventive measures at this point is very, very costly, how can we move towards harnessing private capital for something such as this?
Well, it's happening. It's happening slowly, and you have people putting very significant investments now and to try to accelerate the technological innovations which are needed to try to scale them up. As you know, when anything new comes out, at first it's very expensive and then the costs fall. It was the same when the CD came out or when the first video recorder came out. But really, it needs a fundamental rethink, and we need to accelerate the exit from things like coal, from gas, and a whole seismic shift, but much more urgently than people are thinking, into solar power, wave power, other renewable sources of energy, many of which are free. And the mindset is shifting, but the way you get businesses on board is to show them the risks to their continuance as a business if they don't change. And you do that, as Brady said, in partnership with a regulatory environment that rewards a different way of doing things.
Right. Brady, now funding, when we're talking about funding just being harnessed by the private sector, there is also another issue in the disparity of resources between developed nations and developing nations and trying to adapt to the changes. At this point, what do you think realistically is the expectation of developed nations helping developing nations cope with the changes of climate change?
Unfortunately, I would say realistically, at this point, it's tough to see the developed nations paying their fair share. If we just look back at the climate negotiations that happened last month, nothing really meaningful came out of that. And a big sticking point was that the developed nations didn't want to take responsibility for having caused most of this damage. And they didn't want to step up to the plate to help fund the Green Climate Fund and really help the developing nations with boosting their renewable energy sources, their use of solar, wind, and those types of sources, the types that Brenden mentioned. So I'm sorry to say that if you look at current administrations in the United States, in Australia, it's tough to imagine them being ready to step up to the plate soon, although there are elections coming up in this country. There will be elections in other places, and I'm hopeful that when the people speak up, they will choose leaders who are ready to step up so that the developed countries will pay their fair share and help all the countries in the world so that we can all get to where we need to be.
Right. And I do want to talk a little about something that I mentioned earlier, which is the consequences of not being able to adapt to the changes that are happening. What, Brady, are the consequences, social consequences of not being able to create more resistance within communities and not taking measures to deal and tackle with the emergency we're seeing at this point in time?
Yes, so there are a lot of consequences, certainly social consequences. I focus a lot on migration, and with migration, there are a lot of social consequences from that. In some places, families are being broken apart, where people, maybe a man is leaving to go to work in a city to help support his family because they can no longer support the family on the farm, or families are being separated in other ways due to migration. But also, along with social consequences, there are cultural consequences. And if you look at some countries like the Republic of Kiribati, where much of my family currently lives, you have the possibility of an entire country having to leave, having to move, abandon their islands, and there's no telling where they will go. And a lot of people really have a deep connection to the land they live on. And when you take them away from that land, what's the impact of that going to be, not just on their society, but on their culture and the ability of that culture to persist? So that's a big concern, a big potential impact of climate change.
Right, and that is something that is a frightening thought for the future. What happens when people are displaced, not just the physical displacement, but also the connections they have to the land they've lived on. On that point, thank you so much, Brady Fergusson, for joining us from New York, and Brenden May for joining us from London. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.